The launch of the Sega Dreamcast in North America has long been celebrated for its great list of games, the excitement it generated for the brand, and the easy-to-remember date of 9/9/99. While I had been privy to the Japanese Dreamcast for nearly a year at that point, I confess I got swept up in the excitement as well. Most of the games released on that date had already been out in Japan, some for months, but it was actually the joy of seeing the Sega brand back in the limelight that really did my heart proud. Sega had been absent from any real presence in the North American market for well over a year by the time the Dreamcast was released, slipping from a once powerful command over that market at 60% to a mere single percent by 9/9/99. In essence, Sega had been marginalized to the point of obscurity. Looking back on the release of the Dreamcast in the US on its 20th birthday, I can't help but to reflect on how great things were in the beginning. Sega once again captured the limelight, scooping up the hearts and minds of gamers across the country. For the briefest of time, it looked like the Sega of old was back. Arcade games were seeing ports whether they were 2D or 3D, and third parties seemed like they were on board for the long haul. Hell, even Namco, the staple of PlayStation dominance, even had a better-than-arcade port for the system. Dreamcast was here, and it was an awesome time to be a Sega fan. It has been argued that the North American Dreamcast had the greatest launch of all time in terms of available software. 19 titles would see release for the Dreamcast around its launch date, with big hitters like Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure, and Power Stone leading the charge. Whether it was the best or not, I'll leave up to you, but you certainly have to say at the very least it was a strong list of games. Even the more average stuff like Expendable and Monaco Grand Prix weren't complete piles of shit. The majority of the excitement of course centered on the big release of Sonic's very first full 3D adventure. While hindsight tends to be unkind to Sonic Adventure these days, back then it was all the rage. It was a beautiful game during this time, fast, fun, cinematic. It was exactly what Sega needed to remind fans that the little blue blur could still be relevant in the 3D era of gaming. The first area, Emerald Coast, quickly got you acclimated to Sonic's new gameplay, and the visual prowess of this engine scored major clout with the mainstream and hardcore gamers alike. Of course, no matter how good your mascot was back then, you needed a good fighting game with your system to scoop up the arcade fans that adored them. Lucky for us, the Dreamcast didn't have just one at its launch, but two. Power Stone was a Naomi arcade port from Capcom that brought fighting games truly into the third dimension. Taking place in arenas where you had the ability to go anywhere and use pretty much anything as weapons, you needed to collect 3 Power Stones to morph your character into a super-powered killing machine. Doing so allowed access to moves like projectiles, super combos, and powerful final attacks that did massive damage. I honestly thought this was the future of 3D fighting games when it came out. Fully 3D arenas, go-anywhere gameplay, and environmental weapons and hazards all seem like the logical evolution of the genre. Frankly, I feel Capcom should revisit this design of game again and see where it takes them. There was also the Namco-developed Soul Calibur, a game that actually was developed on a version of the PlayStation hardware in the arcade known as the System 12. When the Dreamcast got a hold of it, it took those funky textures and jaggy polygons and turned it into a tour de force of visual excellence that still holds up easily 20 years later. Soul Calibur is the direct sequel to Soul Edge, another 3D weapons-based fighting game that appeared on the PlayStation after its original arcade run. Its presence on the Dreamcast cannot be overstated. It was huge to see a company that had been so tied to the success of Sony's gaming efforts appear on the Dreamcast. And this wasn't some port of a game long past its expiration date. This was one of Namco's budding franchises that had yet to appear on one of Sony's home systems. And it wasn't a quick and dirty port. Namco added tons, and I mean tons of stuff to unlock and see. Portraits, movies, adventure modes. It was almost overwhelming to see the sheer amount of stuff you could open up and mess with. Soul Calibur was also an excellent playing game that took everything great from Soul Edge and tweaked it to damn near perfection. The variety of characters, the super moves and combo system, the outfits, it all holds up so well today. Plug your Dreamcast up to a VGA box and you have a game that easily remains one of that generation's best.
One, fight!
When it came to sports games, it was the much anticipated NFL 2K that I was looking forward to the most. Sega had absolutely shat the bed when it came to NFL football on the Sega Saturn. First, we never got the promised port of primetime NFL 96, and then when we finally did get an NFL game, we were smacked in the face and spit on for our $50 by the god-awful NFL 97, one of the worst football experiences I've ever had. But the buzz had been great for NFL 2K, and the pictures I had seen gave me hope that Sega had turned it around. And man, did they ever do just that. NFL 2K was a great playing, great looking, and great sounding game of American football. Sega nailed everything. Deep playbooks with tons of strategy and options, a presentation that felt like an actual NFL game, hell, even the commentary was decent, something I typically hated in sports games of the era. I couldn't believe that after the debacle on Saturn, that this was their first attempt on the Dreamcast. This game alone made the North American launch of the system something special for me, and was a return to form for Sega Sports that had been long overdue. The funny thing is that we didn't get just one good NFL game at the Dreamcast launch, but a second. NFL Blitz 2000 turned out to be a pretty solid game of arcade football action itself. It looked great and played fast, just like the arcade original. If simulation-style football wasn't your thing, then the fast pace and over-the-top violence of this might just be. There was also a boxing game called Ready to Rumble released alongside the Dreamcast on the 9th, an arcade brawler with crazy characters and a really easy-to-get-into play style. Basically, you have high and low left and right punches, the ability to feint and block, and an endurance gauge that governs it all. Rack up brutal combos to knock your opponent down 3 times to get a win. It's a simple game that can be a fun 2-player diversion from some of the better games of the day. It was definitely worth a few minutes of your time. Sega also decided to bring out House of the Dead 2 for the launch. This was another one from the Naomi that came home perfectly, nailing that arcade look and feel that set Dreamcast games apart from other systems of the era. I mean, just look at this game run. This was 1999, a year before the PS2. Pure arcade perfection at home. Sega didn't release their Japanese light guns in the US, instead relying on third parties to pick up the slack. This sucked, but having this at home more than made up for it. I was also quite happy with Blue Stinger, a survival horror game that was fully 3D and very much like Resident Evil. The voice acting and story is typical B-movie fluff, but the action is solid and quite fun. The reviews of the time tended not to be kind, but I think for a fully 3D open-world adventure game in 1999, you have to give the game some leeway to make mistakes, especially when you consider the things it was trying to accomplish. I mean, this is in effect what Resident Evil 4 aspired to do some years later. Go in wanting some fun and explosions, and I bet you'll like it as well.
What the hell? Over there.
Expendable was a top-down run-and-gun shooter in the mold of Contra: Legacy of War. Of all the launch software, this has to win the award for squandered potential. It isn't so much that Expendable is a bad game, but it's just how close it was to being something truly fun. The visuals here needed some punch, the gameplay more variety, and man did I get sick of running out of ammo all the time. Had the developers given you weapons that lasted longer, enemies that didn't just sit there waiting to be gunned down, and better controller options, this really could have been good. As it stands, it's a middling experience that you may find interesting to mess with a few times, and a few times more in two-player mode, but nothing you'll come back to time and time again. Midway just didn't have NFL Blitz for us that day. We also got the truly fun boat racing game Hydro Thunder. This had been a popular arcade game that turned out pretty decent on the Dreamcast. The thing is, it had only just come out in the arcade 6 months prior. Showing up on the Dreamcast already was again proof positive that the machine had not just the horsepower to do it justice, but also was easy enough to program for to entice third parties to bring these games out in the first place. The only big negative to this game was that it did not support the VGA mode, so if you were connected directly to your PC monitor, you were shit out of luck. There were also a handful of other racing games released that day that I played. I was excited for TNN Hardcore Heat, an off-road racing game that had different terrain and environments to deal with. It wasn't a terrible game, but it lacked speed and the controls were really weird. I thought the graphics were decent for the time, and I did appreciate the attempt at making the terrain really matter when you hit it. A little more speed and tighter control could have made this a must-own. I also jumped on Tokyo Extreme Racer. I adored the way this one looked, especially its replays, and it played well enough to hold your attention for a while. Based on the popular highway racing in Japan where you flash your lights at another car to signal you want to race, you need to get from point A to point B first, avoiding traffic along the way. It's an easy to get into game that can still be fun even now. The biggest surprise of the North American launch had to be Trick Style, a game from Acclaim no less. This hoverboard racer was a mix of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and Wipeout, and that's nothing but a good thing. The graphics were colorful and detailed, and while the performance could chug here and there when there were a lot of effects at once, the game still played very good. It's a sleeper on the Dreamcast I feel should get more run for such an early title. Sega even brought out a kart racing game called Flag to Flag under the Sega Sports banner, publishing it themselves. It wasn't the prettiest game on the Dreamcast, but the gameplay was actually solid and it was loaded with content. Many licensed tracks, drivers, and cars were at your disposal, making sure you had plenty to see and do. If you run across it cheap, it's worth picking up. There were also a few jet fighter games released with the Dreamcast that day. I was really looking forward to Air Force Delta, Konami's air combat fighter that looked and played just okay. I mean, there is nothing here outright broken, but it just lacks excitement and appeal. It can hold your attention for a few hours, but you'll be back with Soul Calibur or Sonic Adventure in no time. Aero Wings wasn't what I was expecting at all. It isn't really a combat sim in the slightest, instead playing more like a less cute Pilot Wings. You basically have to do what you're told, or the flight instructors scream at you and boom, it's game over. Missions are extremely basic in the beginning, often little more than taking off, turning left and right, and making a successful landing. Even the later stuff rarely amounts to more than flying through rings and avoiding crashes. It can be sort of therapeutic if you don't take it too seriously and just enjoy the views. But again, With so many good games at launch, it was extremely easy to look past stuff like this.
Check target. Look forward.
As good as the overall launch of the Dreamcast was, it wasn't without its stinkers. Pinpin Try was a hyper-cute racing game with animals. I couldn't stand the Japanese version when it was released, and playing the US edition did little to change that. The appeal just isn't there in its gameplay, visuals, or setup. It's slow, almost to the point of meandering, and a game you won't miss if you haven't played it yet. I was also shocked at the lack of quality in Mortal Kombat Gold. Based on the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 4, this game is broken in nearly every aspect. The graphics are a joke next to system powerhouses like Soul Calibur and Power Stone. The gameplay sees little to no improvements, and there are bugs that can bring the entire game to a screeching halt. With the sheer power of the Dreamcast at their command, Namco decided to give Soul Calibur a complete facelift with tons of extras, while Midway decided a quick and dirty port was the way to go. Take note on how to treat your fans, developers. One is forgotten, rotten away in a heap of mediocrity, while the other is considered one of the best games ever. There was also a Ubisoft racer called Monaco Grand Prix, an F1 based affair that was loaded with tracks and looked pretty damn good, but had gameplay I simply never could get into. Despite having an arcade mode, the gameplay was just too fiddly and overly reliant on the brake, destroying any sense of speed or flow. This is fine for super realistic simulations, but when I click into a damn arcade mode, I expect speed, skimming walls at 200 miles an hour, and epic crashes that make me live in constant fear of it all. The overall feeling that day was that Sega was back, the future was undecided, and the competition still a year away. Sega was alone in the next generation market, and they had a powerful entry that gamers would not soon forget. The launch had garnered the attention of not just gaming, but the world's media in general. It was an undeniable time of positivity for Sega. Internal strife pretty much assured that Dreamcast alone would not be enough to change the company's fortunes in the long run, and fading interest in Japan was already having an effect on Sega's confidence in the platform. Less than a year and a half later, Sega would pull the plug on the Dreamcast and end its run as a console hardware maker forever. Nothing will ever take away the hope, joy, and pure excitement of that moment for many of us, however. While brief, the Dreamcast was a hell of a ride and an unforgettable part of our hobby's history. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.